Okay, so continuing on, we're going to talk about I'm going to talk about religion and consumer capitalism. So yeah, let me get into it here. Religion and consumer capitalism, the 1950s. So both Protestant and Roman Catholic leaders spread anti-communism and the Cold War culture in which the nation's religiosity was celebrated. um, so religion an important part of Cold War culture and Cold War politics and foreign policy and lots of different things. During the 1950s, a majority of Americans, actually the highest percentage in American history, were affiliated in some way with a church or a synagogue. In 1954, Congress actually added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. A lot of people think that it's always been there. But no, "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance by Congress in 1954. In 1957, "In God We Trust," in a similar fashion, "In God We Trust" was added to paper money as well. Hollywood movies like The Ten Commandments celebrated early Judaism and Christianity as well. And religious leaders used radio and television to spread to millions, a religious message heavily imbued with anti-communism. Interestingly, religious differences now seemed absorbed in the 1950s, were increasingly absorbed into a common Judeo-Christian heritage, in which Catholics, Protestants, and Jews all possessed or were part of a shared history, and possessed shared values that contributed to American society. And freedom of religion was held to differentiate America from the anti-religious Soviet Union. So, besides freedom being defined as, with consumerism and freedom of choice in a consumer context, freedom was also defined by freedom of religion. That was important in this context. Although the Judeo-Christian concept obscured of course, the long-standing history of religious strife in American life, it reflected the decline of anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism in the United States and increasing secularization in the nation. Although a majority of Americans were affiliated with the church or synagogue, religion had really more to do in this era in the 1950s with personal identity, with group assimilation, and with promoting traditional morality as opposed to spiritual activity. So yeah, religion is more identified with identity, and more important than being a Protestant, a Catholic, or a Jew. It was that you were part of this tradition, this shared religious, of course, but also cultural and intellectual tradition of Judeo-Christian heritage and the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, right? And it was seen as, an identity, and kind of a rallying point for traditional morality in politics that we'll talk more about. Excuse me. Cold War freedom's economic thought. Let me start that again. Cold War freedom's economic content became centered on consumer capitalism, or what became known more commonly as free enterprise. An economic system based on private ownership united the nations of the free world more than political democracy or freedom of speech. Even President Truman replaced mention of freedom from want and fear in his speeches with freedom of enterprise. The selling of free enterprise became a major industry that involved advertising, school programs, newspaper editorials, and civic activities. Yet talk of the virtue of free markets ignored how government policies like federal tax subsidies, for example, mortgage guarantees, infrastructure construction, military contracts, and of course, GI Bill benefits all spurred post-war economic growth. We're going to talk more about this, but yeah, there was an emphasis on selling free enterprise and the idea that freedom in a marketplace, consumer culture, and all of this is increasingly associated with laissez-faire economics, right? Lack of a celebration of government non-intervention in the economy, and especially the federal government not intervening in the economy, that becomes associated with post-war consumerism and affluence, and wealth, increased wealth and economic growth. But a lot of that, again, had to do with things that directly related to government, the GI Bill, mortgage guarantees for veterans, right? Which were a part of the GI Bill, the interstate highway system, military contracts benefited the South and the West, places like Southern California. So government is involved here, right? Even if people want to pretend like it isn't. Okay. Religious anti-communism. Yeah, this is an image from a booklet issued by the American Economic Foundation that illustrates the linkage of anti-communism and religious faith during the Cold War. So the hairy hand in the bottom half of the drawing represents the communist threat, which endangers religious freedom, which is assumed to, or they're making the case, endangers religious freedom in the United States. Excuse me. This is interesting. So this is actually a postage stamp. It says, "These Immortal Chaplains, Interfaith in Action." Let me explain the story behind this. So this postage stamp depicts 4 chaplains who actually perished during the sinking of an American ship during World War II. Its original design actually listed their denomination. So some of them were Catholic, or I think one of them was Catholic, another was Protestant. There was I guess a rabbi in here as well, so representing Judaism. So when the stamp was issued originally in 1948, these words were omitted, in keeping with the emphasis on, again, the words Catholic, Protestant, Jewish were omitted, actually, in keeping with the emphasis on the newly invented idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition shared by all Americans. So the idea is what these men have in common as opposed to what their differences are. Pretty interesting. A portrait of affluence. So this is a photograph by Alex Henderson, and this depicts an employee of DuPont Corporation who poses with his family and the food that they supposedly consumed in a single year, 1951. So the family supposedly spent $1,300, around $12,000 in today's money, on food in 1951, including 699 bottles of milk, 578 pounds of meat, 131 dozen eggs. Nowhere else in the world was food so available and inexpensive. Is it what it's meant to? So the point of this is to illustrate, obviously, that nowhere else in the world was food so was there an overabundance of relatively affordable food? Was food so available and inexpensive as in the United States? And I don't know how they came up with those specific figures of, they consumed 699 bottles of milk and 578 pounds of meat. I don't know if that was sort of like an average, or if this guy kept track of his family's, consumption meticulously in great detail for an entire year. I don't know what the whole story is behind that, but yeah, that's sort of like the average middle class American American family in terms of consumption in in and around the year 1951. Pretty astonishing. Challenges in the golden age. So although Americans had long worried that big business threatened their liberties, they were now told by government officials to embrace large-scale production as a way to fight the Cold War and enhance freedom by spreading consumer goods. Freedom was increasingly defined essentially as freedom of choice for the consumer, right? To many, America seemed to have become a classless society. A steep rise in the number of people investing in Wall Street inspired talk of, quote, a people's capitalism, end quote, a people's capitalism. In 1953, for example, about 4.5 million Americans owned shares of stock, but compare that to the mid-1960s, where about 25 million Americans owned a share of in the stock market, a share of stock. So few could deny that affluence seemed to make poverty a relic of history in the 1950s, or so it was it was commonly thought. So it was assumed. In the 1950s, a few intellectuals as well began to revive conservatism, and reclaim from liberals the idea of freedom. Their ideas eventually defined conservative thought for the rest of the 20th century. Their opposition to a strong national government was fostered by resentments against the New Deal. By the way, so what I'm talking about here is highly relevant to your final paper and to the book that I assigned you to read for the final paper, Suburban Warriors by Lisa McGurr. So I would definitely, pay attention to this. Anyway, so these libertarian leaning conservatives, or basically libertarian conservatives, define freedom as individual autonomy, limited government, and unregulated capitalism. So again, freedom for them was really individual autonomy, limited government, and unregulated capitalism. The principles appeal to conservative entrepreneurs, especially in the developing South and West. Many businessmen looking to earn profits free of government regulations, high taxes, and burdensome unions admired the writings of a young economist named Milton Friedman. So Friedman in 1962 published his most famous book, Capitalism and Freedom, which identified the free market as the foundation of individual liberty. He called for, among other things, privatizing almost all government functions and for the repeal of, for example, minimum wage laws, the graduated income tax, and even the repeal of Social Security established during the New Deal era. Friedman criticized not only liberalism, but also the new conservatism, which was another growing body of 1950s conservative thought, again, called the new conservatism. And this influences, this is relevant, again, to your final paper as well. Believing that the free world had to be morally, had to be morally and intellectually, and not just militarily defended against communism, writers like Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver, increasingly, and these are writers associated with the new conservatism, they increasingly argued that liberals' toleration of differences was no substitute for the search for absolute truth. They called for a return to a civilization based on increasingly on Christian values. They understood freedom as, above all, a moral condition in which individuals were responsible for their own actions and could be coerced by government if they did not make the right decisions. Although the libertarian conservatives and the new conservatives disagreed about priorities and definitions of freedom, they both united against the Soviet Union and liberalism at home. And actually, before I talk more about that, let me just kind of highlight how they disagreed. So yeah, if you think about it, this idea again that freedom above all is a moral condition in which individuals are responsible for their own actions. It could be coerced by government if they did not make the right decision. So there's an absolute truth. The government should uphold that absolute truth, which is in large part derived from biblical principles and Christianity. So that that's sort of like traditional conservatism would seem to be at odds with libertarian conservatism, the sort of live and let live, laissez-faire conservatism, right? But they united in opposition, first of all, to Soviet communism, but more than anything, they united. What they had in common was opposition to big government, and especially the federal government, which I'm going to talk about right now. So again, they both united against the Soviet Union, but especially against liberalism, what they saw as big government liberalism at home. That was the glue that held new conservatives together with libertarians like Milton Friedman. So conservatism in America was now defined by its opposition to big government in the 1950s, increasingly in the 1950s. Republican control of the presidency. Sorry, I lost my place here. Republican control of the presidency did not lessen conservative hostility towards the federal government, and many did not consider Eisenhower one of their own. And actually, I'm going to talk about that right now. So speaking of Eisenhower, let's talk about the Eisenhower era. And the focus question here is, how were the 1950s a period of consensus in both domestic policies and foreign affairs? So again, if you want to write that down, how were the 1950s a period of consensus in both domestic policies and foreign affairs? Okay, so Dwight D. Eisenhower, known as Ike, that was his nickname, Ike, was the most popular military leader to emerge from World War II. Eisenhower supported actually Truman for president in 1948, interestingly, and Truman was a Democrat, of course. And in 1952, both parties actually courted Eisenhower. They both parties wanted him to run for president under their party. Represent their party, as a presidential candidate. But Eisenhower was highly motivated to oust Robert Taft from any chance of winning, Republican Robert Taft from any chance of winning the Republican nomination. So basically, and the reason for that is Eisenhower associated Taft with a turn back to isolationism, which Eisenhower vehemently disagreed with. So it's really Taft's proclivity for isolationism in foreign policy. And interestingly, the conservative movement would go very far in the direction of isolationism very soon. But anyway, Eisenhower ended up picking the Republican side, running for the Republican nomination in 1952, and securing the Republican nomination. He chose as his running mate, actually, Richard Nixon of California, who had become prominent as a result of being on the House of Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. And basically, anti-communism, anti-communist activism, I should say, particularly against Alger Hiss, brought Nixon into the public eye and gained awareness of Nixon and his presidential and vice presidential and political aspirations. Though Nixon thus gained a reputation for opportunism, dishonesty, he was also a skillful politician who led efforts to change the Republican Party's image from being a defender of business to being a champion of the forgotten man, the hardworking citizen burdened by heavy taxes and government bureaucracy. So Nixon was really the first prominent Republican politician to, maybe a better way to put it was, he was a harbinger of things to come. So the Republican Party in many ways become the party, or at least their political appeals are increasingly into the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. Their political appeals are drawn from this idea, rooted in this idea of representing the forgotten working man, but it's increasingly defined as the white kind of the white working class are the people they're seeking to represent. Who are they protecting the white working class against? It's the heavy hand of taxation of the federal government. Nixon and Nixon being involved in the presidential campaign of 1952 and serving as vice president kickstarted that strain in the conservative movement to a large extent, I would say. Let's see, using populist language to promote free market economies, or free market economics, Nixon helped to lay the foundation again for the triumph of conservatism a generation later. What else do we want to say here? Let me talk about the 1952 presidential campaign. So, as soon as Nixon got the vice presidential nomination, he ran into trouble, and Eisenhower almost dropped him off the ticket. However, he was actually able to use television and what became known as his checker speech to convince Americans that the family dog Checkers was the only gift he had received and was not returning. So basically, he was accused of receiving gifts from well-connected political insiders, and he was basically accused of being corrupt. And to defend himself, he said the only gift he received was a family dog, and how dare you, I love this dog, and how dare you say that this dog was just a part of political corruption or something. A very interesting appeal. But anyway, the speech functioned to rescue Nixon's political career, importantly, and illustrated the change TV was making on the political process. The 1952 presidential campaign was actually the first to show how television changed politics, as candidates crafted images that were projected directly into Americans' living rooms. Eisenhower's popularity dominated the election, however, and public frustration with the Korean War, along with Eisenhower's pledge to bring peace, won him an overwhelming victory over Adlai Stevenson in 1952, the Democratic candidate. 4 years later, Eisenhower again bested Stevenson for by an even larger margin, but the Republicans did not gain power in Congress. And in 1954, the Democrats regained control of Congress and held it for the rest of the 1950s. Significantly, Eisenhower made major inroads in the Democratic South, but Democrats at the same time continued to control almost all southern states and local offices. So here we also see maybe the very beginnings of political realignment. Now we associate the South as being a Republican stronghold, a conservative stronghold, and a Republican Party stronghold, basically. And for really going all the way back to the age of Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 1830s, the South was a Democratic Party stronghold, even before that, to a certain extent. The South was very much a Democratic Party stronghold, and so, yeah, the very beginnings of the South moving in the direction of the Republican Party can be seen in their proclivity for Eisenhower and his candidacy in 52 and 56. Okay. Let's see. Voters across the world elected let's not talk about that. I don't want to muddy the waters. Okay, so yeah, this is a Eisenhower campaign appearance in Baltimore in 1952. And this is an Adlai Stevenson poster as well. And yeah, these are the very lopsided results of the 1952 presidential election. So you could see the only place won by the only region of the country, that significantly supported the Democrat Adlai Stevenson was the South. Most of the Deep South, including Kentucky and West Virginia, and the rest of the country went for the Republican Eisenhower. Okay, so let's talk about modern republicanism, how this relates to Eisenhower, how this relates to unionism and the social contract. So with the Republican president, after a long period of Democratic control, business once again heavily influenced Washington and the executive branch. Eisenhower, an ally of business and a fiscal conservative, worked to reduce government spending, including with regards to the military, including the military budget. But some Republicans wanted to roll back the New Deal. Ike knew this would be political suicide. So Eisenhower's domestic agenda, called, quote, modern republicanism, again, modern republicanism associated with Eisenhower, was intended to end Republicans' association with Hoover, the Great Depression, and social indifference. So under Eisenhower, New Deal programs actually expanded and the size of government actually grew. Free enterprise, as it was called, may have been a potent American weapon in the Cold War, but it's more accurate to say that mixed economy, a combination of public and private enterprise, individual efforts and individuals in the private sector, along with the state, the arm of government. This mixed economy played a role in planning economic activity, and especially in the West and in the South in the 1950s and beyond. So the U.S. allies, Britain and France, actually expanded welfare and nationalized key industries in the 1950s, like steel, shipbuilding, and transportation. But the United States had a smaller welfare state than Western Europe, and left major industries in private hands. At the same time, government spending, such as the aforementioned creation of an interstate highway system, boosted productivity and employment. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial Earth satellite in 1957, the Eisenhower administration actually responded with the National Defense Education Act, which offered direct funding to higher education. in the interest of sort of keeping up with the Soviets in science and technology and space exploration and et cetera. Rather than dismantling the New Deal, the modern republicanism of Eisenhower consolidated and legitimized it, which made the New Deal's survival essentially guaranteed, regardless of which party held the White House. In terms of unions, so the 1950s also saw stability in terms of the relationship between labor and capital, labor relations, basically. The 1947 Taft-Hartley Act reduced labor militancy. And in 1955, the AFL and CIO merged into one organization representing 35% of non-farm workers. In key industries, labor and management established what came to be called a new social contract. So the idea behind the social contract was basically it's an alternative to labor militancy and widespread strikes and strife and acrimony between labor and capital. And it sought to put in place on essentially a permanent basis, at least was the idea, concessions from both sides that would keep business going, that would keep people employed, and would avoid, again, labor militancy and strikes and work stoppages and labor violence that had occurred so often in America's past. So unions left decisions about, for example, unions left decisions about capital investment, plant location, and output to managers, and agreed to suppress unauthorized wildcat strikes in return for employers' acceptance of unions, wage increases, and fringe benefits like private pensions, health insurance, and automatic adjustments to cover rises in living costs. Though unionized workers shared in 1950s prosperity, the social contract just described applied to few workers. Unions won increases the minimum wage, but they did little for non-union workers in this period. Most workers did not enjoy the wages and benefits of union work. Non-union employees continued to combat labor unions. In some firms still move production to the cheaper non-union South. A 1959 strike provoked by steel companies attempted to reduce the union's power over production. However, by the 1960s, the social contract was weakening. Okay. Yeah, educational cartoon. So what did I want to say about this? Yeah, so basically, Alan Dunn, this is a cartoon by Alan Dunn in New Yorker, the New Yorker magazine. And it comments on how Soviet success in launching an artificial Earth satellite spurred a focus on improving scientific education in the United States. I don't know if they cut off the caption here. But the caption is supposed to say, do you call C- catching up with Russia? So that's the caption. Let me just see what else I want to get to here. Okay, let's talk about Cold War tensions. Okay, Cold War tensions. So once elected, Eisenhower quickly ended the Korean War, but Cold War tensions increased. In 1952, the United States exploded the first hydrogen bomb, which was far more destructive than the atom bomb. The next year, the Soviets, in turn, had the hydrogen bomb too. And both powers built long-range bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons across the globe. Although Eisenhower was a professional soldier who hated war, his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, relished it. In 1954, Dulles actually updated U.S. containment policy with his doctrine of, quote, massive retaliation. This policy stated that any Soviet attack on a U.S. ally would be met with a nuclear assault on the Soviet Union. This new focus on nuclear weapons let Eisenhower reduce spending on conventional military forces. And during his presidency, the size of the armed forces actually dropped, while the number of nuclear weapons increased dramatically to about 18,000 in around 1960. Massive retaliation ran the risk that even a small conflict might rapidly escalate into a nuclear war that would destroy the United States and the Soviet Union. Critics called it brinksmanship, but the reality that war would result in, quote, as it was known, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. again, mutually assured destruction, made the United States and the USSR more cautious. It also spread fear of an imminent nuclear war. Government appeals to build bomb shelters in backyards and school drills where students hid under their desks were meant to convince Americans they could survive a nuclear war. But these, of course, only increased widespread fear in the 1950s. Though Eisenhower embraced Cold War rhetoric, he believed that the Cold War's end and Stalin's death in 1953 signaled the Soviets were reasonable and could be reached through normal diplomacy. In 1955, for example, he met with Soviet Premier Khrushchev in Switzerland. The next year, Khrushchev actually denounced, in a pretty stunning turn of events, Khrushchev actually denounced Stalin's crimes at a Moscow Communist Party conference. Or Congress. These revelations sparked a crisis of belief and confidence in communists worldwide. Including in the United States, where most remaining members in the Communist Party actually abandoned the communist cause. That same year, Khrushchev called for, quote, peaceful coexistence with the United States. But this thaw in the Cold War ended when Soviet troops suppressed an anti-communist revolt in Hungary in 1956. Well, some Republicans called for liberating Europe. Eisenhower did not aid the Hungarian rebels, but at the same time, he did not aid the Hungarian rebels. He did not believe it was possible to roll back Soviet power in Eastern Europe. In 1958, the United States and the USSR agreed to halt nuclear weapon tests. And this lasted actually about 3 years until 1961. In 1959, Khrushchev even toured the United States and met with Eisenhower. But in 1960, tensions returned when Soviets shot down a U.S. spy plane over Soviet territory. So this is a bomb shelter, H-bomb hideaway. It's a photograph taken in 1955, which shows a family in their underground bomb shelter, where the manufacturer claimed at least the occupants could survive for 5 days after a nuclear war. And this is Bert the Turtle. So this says, Bert the Turtle says, duck and cover from the Federal Civil Defense Administration. Yeah, this is an advertisement for a government film explaining to children how to survive a nuclear attack by hiding under their desks. Thousands of schools instituted these duck and cover drills. These were meant to reduce Americans' fear of nuclear war. Yeah, again, this seems like this would increase anxiety more than lessen anxiety. And if there's really a nuclear bomb going off, I'm not sure what getting under your desk would do, but I might be wrong about that. But yeah, this is part and parcel with the foreign policy, politics, culture of the time. Quite interesting to think about. Excuse me. And I think this is the last section I'm going to get to here. So the third world, and starting with the emergence of the third world. So how does the so-called third world fit into a Cold War context, and how is this important within the context of the history of this time period from an American perspective? So even though the Cold War divided Europe into communist and capitalist regions without war, hence why it was called the Cold War, it sparked competition and military conflict in what became known as the Third World. So the term Third World was used to describe basically developing countries that were not aligned, that were aligned basically neither with the United States and capitalism and basically free markets and free society. Associated with the United States, but also not aligned with unfree economy, command economy, and political authoritarianism, essentially. So these countries sought really to develop their economies without strictly going with one model or the other model, right? So without adherence strictly to central government planning, or again, strictly to free market capitalism. So the Bandung Conference, held in Indonesia in 1955, announced the emergence of a new force representing a majority of the world's population. However, none of these nations escaped Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the post-war period, Europe's empires crumbled. Decolonization in Asia and Africa began when India and Pakistan achieved independence in 1947. And of course, Pakistan was carved out of India as a basically a Muslim version of India. In the late 1950s, other nations such as Ghana, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, etc., followed with their own successful independence movements. In 1975, even Portugal, which had created Europe's first modern overseas empire during the early age of exploration, importantly gave up independence to its African colonies, Mozambique and Angola. Facing decolonization, the United States feared that power vacuums in the former colonies would be penetrated by Soviet allied communists. And that's really why the United States cared about this and got involved in the process of decolonization and independence and political consolidations for these newly independent countries. The Soviets supported the dissolution of Europe's colonial empires, and communists participated in national movements for independence. Leaders of new nations often saw socialism in one form or another as the best means to economic independence and narrowing social inequalities created by imperialism. While most new third world nations sided with neither power, the United States was admired at the same time by many nationalists for its own struggle for colonial independence, going back to the American Revolution. For example, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, the communist leader of Vietnam's movement in French rule there, modeled his 1945 Declaration of Nationhood on the Declaration of Independence. Famously, Ho Chi Minh was also a noted admirer of Woodrow Wilson and his ideas of global self-determination. By the end of the 1950s, the division of Europe seemed to be set in stone. So much of the focus of the Cold War shifted to the Third World. The policy of containment was used to justify opposition to governments, whether they were communist or not. Two world leaders, and it was Jacobo Guzman in Guatemala and Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, were popularly elected nationalists, so not communists, but nationalists, free of Soviet influence. However, because both leaders were interested in land reform and were also interested in lessening the amount of foreign investment in their countries, they were both branded in 1953. Sorry, they were both branded as communists, and the CIA actually overthrew both governments in 1953 and 1954. And famously, this led to, in Iran, to the installing of the very authoritarian Shah, who was seen as sort of like an American puppet. And was a secular ruler who was seen as mostly illegitimate among the majority in Iran. And long story short, basically you can draw a line between that and the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which of course ushered in an age of Iran and America being arch enemies, right? So America itself, in interfering with the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh, really set in place, laid the groundwork for this very unfortunate series of events, both for Iran and for the United States itself. In 1956, Israel, France, and Britain invaded Egypt after Gamal Abdel Nasser, the nationalist leader, nationalized the Suez Canal. This invasion enraged Eisenhower, who forced them to abandon the mission and began the replacement of Britain with the United States as the main Western power in the Middle East. This shift also brought American oil companies to invest in the region's oil fields. In 1957, the Eisenhower Doctrine expanded the policy of containment to the Middle East countries threatened by communism or Arab nationalism, like that of Nasser's, coming from Nasser. In a test of his doctrine, Eisenhower dispatched 5,000 American troops to Lebanon to protect Nasser's efforts to bring all Arab states into a single regime under his rule. Similarly, in Vietnam in 1945, when the Japanese were expelled, the French moved to crush a national independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh, who I just mentioned, and reassert its colonial rule. Anti-communism pulled the United States deeper into involvement in Southeastern Asia and in Vietnam specifically. Following a policy set by Truman, Eisenhower gave billions of dollars in aid for French efforts. And by the early 1950s, the United States was paying for 4/5 of the cost of France's war in Vietnam. Again, essentially anti-colonial war, which the United States saw as an anti-communist war, was the idea. But Eisenhower did not send U.S. troops in 1954 when French forces were on the verge of defeat. Rejecting National Security Council advice to use nuclear weapons, Eisenhower actually left France no choice but to concede Vietnamese independence. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam temporarily into northern and southern districts, with elections in 1956 set to unify the country. But the anti-communist southern leader, Diem, his name was Diem, at the suggestion of the United States, refused to hold elections, which both parties knew would result in communist victory. Diem's Catholicism, along with his ties to landlords in the country, along with his ties to landlords in the country, of small farmers and in a country largely of Buddhists, in Vietnam, served to alienate many Vietnamese. Diem was seen as an illegitimate ruler who was an American puppet, essentially. And this led to the emergence in 1960 of a guerrilla war launched by the communist-led National Liberation Front, centered in the northern in North Vietnam. And of course, the United States would escalate its military involvement in 1964 with tragic consequences, and we wouldn't leave for about a decade, until about a decade after that. So let's see. That's a picture of Mohammad Mossadegh ringing the Liberty Bell. Again, he, by all accounts, supported American liberty and was not aligned with the communists, but was unfortunately overthrown in, at least what in hindsight looks like a very big mistake. This is the military junta actually installed in Guatemala by the CIA in 1954. And this is a picture of the leaders of the junta entering Guatemala City in a Jeep driven by CIA agent Carlos Castillo Armas. Although hailed by the Eisenhower administration as a triumph for freedom, the new government suppressed democracy in Guatemala and embarked on a murderous campaign to stamp out opposition. Okay, and yeah, quickly, let me talk about society in the Eisenhower era. So despite the apparent rule of consensus in American society, in which McCarthyism made criticism of the status quo seem disloyal, freedom seemed to be located in the private enjoyment of consumer goods, and political debate was narrowed by the Cold War. It's important to point out that dissent certainly did exist, right? Not everybody agreed with this homogenous culture and mode of politics and society, and et cetera. Some intellectuals, for example, thought that affluence in the Cold War mentality obscured the degree to which the United States did not live up to its own ideal of freedom. In 1957, for example, the political scientist Hans Morgenthau argued that the free enterprise had created, quote, new accumulations of power that threatened individual liberty. Similarly, the sociologist C. Wright Mills challenged the idea that democratic pluralism defined American life and argued that America was ruled by a, quote, power elite, and that's what the title of his famous book, The Power Elite. That's what it was called. And he argued that an interlocking directorate of corporate leaders, politicians, and military men dominated government and society, and thus made political democracy obsolete, and denied real freedom of choice to Americans. That was C. Wright Mills's The Power Elite. Some argued that modernity itself produced psychological and cultural discontent, and they worried that mass society produced a loneliness and anxiety that made people desire not freedom, but authority and stability. Social scientists and critics argued that Americans were conformists who were unable to be independent thinkers and actors, and that corporate bureaucracies turned employees into organization men and capable of independent thought. Other critics worried that Americans had lost their commitment to the common good. One of those critics was John Kenneth Galbraith, who wrote The Affluent Society, The book is called The Affluent Society in 1958. And in this book, Galbraith wondered how American society could neglect public investments in schools, parks, public services, right, while producing ever more goods to satisfy consumer desires. So Galbraith basically was pointing out the disconnect between an emphasis on public, an emphasis on the public, an emphasis on the private, consumerism, and private consumer wealth, right? He saw that that there was so much emphasis on the private sphere that the public sphere was being neglected, is essentially the idea. Let's see. Other books criticize the monotony of modern work, the emptiness of suburban life, and the influence of advertising. But this social and cultural critique did little to transform American life in the 1950s, although it did lay the groundwork for, more serious critiques that actually produced meaningful changes in American society and politics and culture and economics in the 1960s and 1970s. But yeah, in the 1950s, really, these critics did not offer a political alternative or influence party politics or government for the most part. But with a very large and growing youth population, thanks to the baby boom, of course, popular culture revealed tensions beneath the quiet surface of 1950s life. For example, J.D. Salinger's novel Catcher in the Rye, published in 1951, and films like Rebel Without a Cause, of course, starring James Dean. This came out in 1955, emphasized the alienation of youth from the adult world. Such work stimulated adult fears of widespread juvenile delinquency, is what they called it, and led even comic book publishers in some cases to regulate their publications for fear of being associated with this youth culture of alleged juvenile delinquency. Teenagers wore leather jackets and danced to rock and roll music that brought the hard rhythms and sexually provocative movements of Black musicians and dancers to white audiences. And of course, this was embodied by the music of, for example, Elvis Presley in the 1950s, right? The debut of magazines like Playboy in the 1950s openly flaunted a fantasy world of sexuality for men outside of the family. So there's dissent going on, right, beneath the surface here. Suffice to say, yeah. And so this is Rebels Without a Cause. Yeah. This is a depiction of teenagers in Coney Island, New York in the late 1950s, in some ways, mimicking James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause of the 1955 and embodying this sort of rebellious youth culture. There's Elvis Presley, obviously, in front of his adoring fans, alarming many adults, undoubtedly. Yeah, this is a poetry meeting at a beat coffee house in New York City. And this photograph was taken in 1959. Yeah, this is a place where poets, artists, and others who rejected 1950s mainstream culture gathered. Okay, so I think let's go in there. Thanks for listening. Hopefully that was helpful for you, and I'll see you in the next video for the next module. All right.